We're recording. Fantastic. All right, so this is looking at the progressives at the federal government level and what was achieved in each administration. If you don't mind, I'll turn out the lights here a little bit, so maybe that'll help with the screenshots. If you'd like to put that closer, you can put it on the table. That's not a problem. There we go. How's that? Hey, look at that. Man, that works. That's actually pretty good. Still bright. Yeah, it is what it is. Okay. All right, so anyway, progressive success at the federal level. When we talk about progressive success at the federal level, we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. They are considered to be the progressive presidents. All three have some things in common. All three of them believed that the federal government could be used as a means of helping people. All three believed in using broad executive power to achieve that end. But they had differences of opinion, some more subtle than others, about how to proceed. And when you think about Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson and what they achieved at the federal level, considering the myriad of problems that existed in the United States at this time, it will become clear where the federal government was particularly effective and where they were not particularly effective in grappling with the problems of the day. When everybody thinks of Teddy Roosevelt as president, foreign policy-wise, they think about what? Big stick diplomacy, Roosevelt corollary, the Great White Fleet, negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War, exertive foreign policy in order to spread American idealism around the globe. When we think of Teddy Roosevelt domestically here at home, we always think of him as, well, the cowboy, Mark Hanna, now that damn cowboy is president. But the idea of the bully pulpit, the fact Roosevelt believed that because he was elected by all the American people, that he was uniquely positioned to be able to be an advocate for the American people in a way that senators and representatives were not. I was elected by all of the American people, therefore my job, as I see it, is to be an advocate for those American people and to use my office of the president to advocate, to convince, to cajole, to twist arms, to form public opinion, what Roosevelt called the bully pulpit, to speak on the people's behalf. And this famous quote here, I did not usurp power, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. So when we look at Roosevelt's presidency, yes, he expands executive power. He is not a laissez-faire conservative. He is not a hands-off conservative. And he belongs to a party of laissez-faire conservatives. So he is unique. And the only reason he is president of the United States is why? Because the president got assassinated. William McKinley was a laissez-faire, pro-business, hands-off, didn't believe in exerting executive power for the benefit of the people. Teddy Roosevelt was made vice president to get him out of the way because he was trying to reform New York State as governor. And now he's president of the United States. And he's going to exert executive power in a way that other Republicans like McKinley and Harrison and Arthur and Hayes and all those guys had not previously done. Roosevelt is known as the trust buster. Why? Because he busts trusts. He is very good at it. He exerts executive authority to go after what he considers to be dangerous business organizations. And the way he differentiates between good trusts and bad trusts are that good trusts provide a public service and therefore can be regulated. Roosevelt does not believe that all big business monopolies and trusts need to be broken up because some of them serve a public good. They serve the nation's interest because they are efficient. However, there are bad trusts. There are business organizations that do not serve the nation's interest, that only serve themselves, that are only interested in corporate greed, that are only interested in feathering their own nests and buying politicians who will look the other way as they do whatever it is that they do. Roosevelt believes that those bad trusts need to be eliminated. And the trusts that provide a national service need to be regulated by the federal government. This is something new. No other president had really tried to do this. And so Roosevelt is going to use that executive power to go after, this is the first time, he does it a number of times, but this is the first action where you see that occur in 1902. Roosevelt goes after what's called the Northern Securities Railroad. And it is a railroad owned by J.P. Morgan. Now, why does he go after J.P. Morgan? J.P. Morgan's a well-known billionaire in America. When we think of J.P. Morgan, what do we normally think about? Banks, absolutely. He ran the monopoly on banks. But in 1900, he bought United States Steel, which was the monopoly in steel. He bought it for $1 billion. And now he's in banking, now he's in steel, and now he wants to get into railroads. Roosevelt sees that as too much power concentrated in the hands of one individual. It does not serve the nation's interest. And so Roosevelt breaks it up. And he's going to break up a number of other trusts and monopolies as well. Roosevelt is really the first president of the United States to effectively break up or regulate monopolies and trusts. Subsequent presidents break up and regulate more monopolies and trusts than Roosevelt, but because Roosevelt does it first, he's known as the trust buster. Matter of fact, I would argue William Howard Taft does a better job of it. He doesn't get any credit. Roosevelt is also going to step into the middle of strikes. Previously, for instance, the railroad strike of 1877, or the Pullman workers' strike, which was another railroad strike in 1894. What was the federal government's reaction to those strikes? What did they do? Yeah, troops. They issued what was called an injunction. Okay? But the use of troops to forcibly stop a strike. And up until about 1900, on what side did the federal government normally come down in a conflict between ownership and labor? Ownership, always. Labor unions like the National Labor Union, like the Knights of Labor, were seen as revolutionaries. They were seen as radicals. They were seen as socialists. They were seen as communists. It was believed that there were anarchists, littered throughout these organizations, that they were bent on toppling democracy and capitalism and supplanting it with communism and socialism. Roosevelt treats labor unions differently than previous presidents. He negotiates with them. he gives them a seat at the table. In the 1902 anthracite coal strike, by giving labor unions, and specifically these coal miners, by giving these coal miners a seat at the table, he legitimizes their right to exist and be heard. This is the first time a president is actually acknowledging the right of a labor union to be heard. And while Roosevelt does threaten the union, he threatens the workers, he also threatens the coal miner, the owners of the coal mine. And he says, look, man, if you guys don't work together, I'm just going to have the federal government step in and take over this mine. Wow. That's pretty impressive. So he's busting trusts. He's talking with labor unions in a way that they had not previously done before. And he's regulating other businesses as well. He is a consumer advocate. And I mean, he falls into this kind of butt backwards. But after reading The Jungle, the Congress, the president demand action. Something needs to be done to clean up the food processing, meat packing, and other businesses, particularly the drug industry. There were all sorts of phony medicines and patent medicines out there. There were nothing but, what they called snake oil. Hey, here's a magic elixir that can solve all your problems. I can give you a good case in point. Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola started off as one of these medicines. Medicine. Do you know why? It had cocaine in it. That's why it's called Coca-Cola. It had cocaine in it. And they were selling this stuff over the counter. And so the federal government is going to step in and regulate that. That there has to be truth in labeling. That the product has to do what you say it's going to do. That the product has to have in it what the ingredients label says are in it. So you get, after The Jungle, you get the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, and that helps create the Food and Drug Administration. A consumer watchdog agency, the federal government, you're expanding the role of the executive branch in order to regulate businesses, particularly food and drug businesses. And I mean, it wasn't just the president that was interested in what was going on. The Congress also held hearings. They wanted to know what was going on. They investigated it. They issued a report early in 1906 called the Neil Reynolds Report. It wasn't a guy named Neil Reynolds. It was a guy named Neil and a guy named Reynolds. But the Neil Reynolds Report is the congressional investigation into what was alleged in The Jungle. And what the Neil Reynolds Report revealed was, yes, indeed, there is chicanery going on in the meatpacking industry in America. So talk about a government acting quickly. The Jungle's published in early 1906. Congress immediately holds hearings. The president demands action. And by summer 1906, you've got a regulatory agency in place. So your Congress and your president can act when properly motivated. Let's stop. Take a brain break real quick. Let's think back on the question. How effective are progressives at solving problems of the era? Teddy Roosevelt, so far, what does he seem to be most effective at doing? Solving what problems? Yeah, Brian. Regulating businesses. Absolutely. So what could you lump it under? Political, economic, social? Economic. Absolutely. The federal government right now is doing a really good job at economic regulation. Even labor unions fall under economic regulation. Okay? So at this point, economic regulation seems to be something that the Roosevelt administration is very good at. Roosevelt is also going to expand the power of the presidency to regulate railroads and give the Interstate Commerce Commission authority, to give the agency teeth. The ICC had been founded back in 1887. And yes, it was an oversight committee, it was an investigatory committee, and they could say, yeah, that railroad is abusing their power and authority, but they had no real authority to do anything about it. Roosevelt, under the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, gives the ICC the authority to actually step in and do something about railroads that are abusing their power and privilege. Even going so far in the Hepburn Act as telling railroads what a fair rate is. Railroads charging this much, the ICC steps in and says, no, you can't charge that much. You should charge this much. Yeah. You should. And if you choose not to, the federal government is going to step in and maybe launch an antitrust suit against you. So there's that threat with a hammer. And so you're trying to clean up the abuse of railroads. And he also expands the executive branch by creating the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce. The Department of Labor, their job, listen to the demands of labor. Department of Commerce, listen to the demands of the business owners. So you've got agencies within the executive branch who are responsive to the needs of both sides in labor disputes. One other thing Teddy Roosevelt is known for, and this is something that no other president really had tackled, and very few presidents have really tackled, the environment. Teddy Roosevelt was a lover of the outdoors. He was a big game hunter, liked to go outside, loved the fresh air, wanted to preserve the land that America had, believed it was one of our greatest natural resources, an inheritance to leave to our children. So he passes two important acts, the Newlands Act and the National Monuments Act. Now, the National Monuments Act sets aside land to be preserved. For instance, Zuni National Park out in Arizona, Devil's Tower, which is a national monument out in Wyoming, Yosemite National Park. Okay, so you're preserving these natural wonders for future generations. The Newlands Act was an irrigation project in the Southwest to turn desert land into arable farming land by bringing in water. Now, Roosevelt does not believe that businesses should be banned from exploiting our natural resources. That's not the case. He's not saying you can't touch all of these areas. He's saying we need to be good stewards of the environment. That if we're going to cut down a forest, maybe we should replant trees so that we have renewable resources. What a concept. we could use our resources wisely. So, in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt gets to run for re-election in his own right. The conservative Republicans are beside themselves. You know, they had conservative Republican, laissez-faire, hands-off presidents all the way up until 1901. And now you've got this progressive Republican that's exerting executive authority, regulating businesses, talking to labor unions, setting rates, breaking up monopolies, cleaning up government, trying to create honest and efficient government here on behalf of all the American people. And the conservative Republicans are just, they're beside themselves. They're to use a big word, they're apoplectic. But Teddy Roosevelt runs on his appeal to the American people for election in his own right. And he wins re-election. Now, how good do you think this election is going to be for Roosevelt, 1904? Where do you think he will win or won't win? Yeah. Helping labor unions. Labor unions love Teddy Roosevelt. Absolutely. Where else do you think he's going to win? South? He's a Republican. Okay.
Out west.
Why?
Cowboy.
He's a cowboy. Peels out there. Out west, he's regulating railroads. He's an environmentalist. He's talking about preserving natural resources. Guys, Teddy Roosevelt wins a pretty convincing re-election in 1904. The only region he doesn't win is the South. And the reason why he doesn't, well, you tell me why he doesn't win the South. Huh? And what does that have to do with anything?
South only votes Democrat.
What?
South only votes Democrat.
Why? It's called the Solid South, and they've been doing it since 1876, 1880. From Reconstruction, yeah, Southerners, that Reconstruction is fresh in their memory. They're not going to vote for a Republican. They vote Democrat. This coffee cup could run as a Democrat in the South, and it'd win. It would win. Roosevelt runs. He takes his entire legislative agenda, railroad regulation, advocacy of labor unions, consumer advocacy, and he lumps it under what he calls a square deal. A square deal for the American people. What does it mean to be square with people? Straight. I'm square with you. I'm being honest. I'm going to be an honest broker on your behalf. The term square deal sums up an entire philosophy of governance. Are you for the big business interests, or are you for the American people? Just by saying you're square sends the message of honesty. All right. So Teddy Roosevelt wins in 1904, convincingly. Very successful president. 1904, you think about all the things that Teddy Roosevelt could run on. Railroad regulation, breaking up monopolies, restraining monopolies, regulation of businesses, environmental issues, taking the Panama Canal, sending the Great White Fleet out, negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He could run on ending the Philippine insurrection peacefully, acquiring an empire, intervening in Latin America when need be. exerting American influence at home and abroad. Teddy Roosevelt has one of the better first terms of any American president. He's got a very successful first term. Yeah. What do you think? Second terms do suck. And indeed, in 1907, you have a panic, a stock market panic. Now, this bank panic leads to a stock market downturn. A lot of banks find that they've got a shortage of cash on hand. America's running out of cash. People are panicking, running to the bank, pulling their money out of the bank. And it gets progressives thinking, you know what? We've had a lot of these boom-bust cycles. Prosperity, depression. Prosperity, depression. Is there something we could do to fix that problem? To make money, the production of money, more efficient and fair for everybody? It's the Panic of 1907 that inspires congressional leaders and politicians to seek a solution, which ultimately becomes the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Now, that's done under Woodrow Wilson, but it is one of the attempts at a solution to a problem. All right, so really this is the only bad thing that happens during Roosevelt's second term. And at the end of 2 terms, Roosevelt decides he's going to honor the 2-term precedent. He could have run again. He was only 50 years old. He could have run for a 3rd term, and I believe he would have easily won re-election. This panic regardless. But he chooses to honor the 2-term precedent, volunteers to step down, and he is going to look for a successor. He is going to look for a successor who will continue the Roosevelt legacy. What does that sound like? What other presidents have looked for successors to continue their legacy? Okay. What other presidents have sought to continue their legacy beyond 2 terms by picking a successor? You're all looking at them. Nobody wants to say anything because you're too chicken. I could be wrong. And what would happen if I'm wrong? I won't get my gold star. I won't get my ribbon. I won't get my check plus. Washington had a hand-picked successor. John Adams, how'd he do? Did he? He only served 1 term. Alien Sedition Acts were not very popular. John Adams was certainly no George Washington. Anybody else have a hand-picked successor? Thomas Jefferson, his hand-picked successor was James Madison, absolutely. He was generally successful. He had 2 terms, but the Capitol was burned on his watch, so that's problematic. Anybody else have a hand-picked successor? Who? Yes! Martin Van Buren was supposed to be a 3rd term of Andrew Jackson. Was it? No! Absolutely not. Teddy Roosevelt's looking for a guy to carry on his legacy. And he picks William Howard Taft. And let me tell you something, folks. William Howard Taft is no Teddy Roosevelt. Okay? He serves 1 term. Now, in 1908, he is elected overwhelmingly. It's a landslide victory over William Jennings Bryan. That's right, William Jennings Bryan ran a third time and lost. Just couldn't. He's the Henry Clay of his day. He just couldn't take a hint. But the problem with Taft is that Taft doesn't have the personality that Teddy Roosevelt had. Teddy Roosevelt was outgoing, physical, energetic. Taft is fat. No, and I'm not saying that to be disparaging. I'm saying it because it created health problems for him. The man is 360 pounds. Is he energetic? No. He's lethargic. He did get stuck in the White House bathtub. You are correct, and that's what most people know William Howard Taft for. Is the president that got stuck in the bathtub. Yeah, I know. But a lot of people believe, a lot of historians believe, that Taft suffered from sleep apnea because he was so heavy. And does anybody know what sleep apnea does? Makes you stop breathing in your sleep, so you're not getting oxygen while you're sleeping. Your brain is deprived of oxygen, and so you're kind of hazy. And there are stories of William Howard Taft literally falling asleep during cabinet meetings because he couldn't stay awake. So there's a lot to support the idea that Taft physically may not have been up to a job as demanding as President of the United States. Now, when everybody thinks about Taft, they always think about these three incidents that occur. But I will say this, William Howard Taft is really good at breaking up trusts. He doubles the number of antitrust suits that Teddy Roosevelt had. As a matter of fact, it's William Howard Taft that breaks up Standard Oil. But Taft has some problems. One, he signs the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Ooh, the name Aldrich, I've heard that name before. He's that corrupt senator from Rhode Island. The Payne-Aldrich tariff, the Payne tariff was supposed to lower tariff rates. Progressives believed in lower tariff rates. Why? More competition. More competition does what? Lowers prices, which is good for everybody. Progressives believe in low tariffs. But Aldrich places so many amendments on this tariff bill that in the end, it actually raised the tariff. And Taft signed it, which made him look like he was in favor of high tariffs. Taft actually believed it was the best tariff bill he was going to get, so he better sign it. Taft was a compromiser. Taft was one of these guys that tried to make both sides feel good. And so he was trying to work with what he had. That kind of was a failure. Then Taft fires the head of the National Forestry Service, Gifford Pinchot. Why? Because Pinchot ratted on his boss, the Secretary of the Interior, a guy by the name of Richard Ballinger. Pinchot found out that the Secretary of Interior, Ballinger, was using his office for corruption. He was making money off of his office. How was he doing it? The Secretary of the Interior is in charge of all the natural resources in the United States. He was allowing companies to exploit America's natural resources and taking bribes for doing it. Pinchot finds this out and rats on his boss, Ballinger. Taft fires Pinchot for going outside the chain of command. A breach of protocol, so Pinchot gets fired. So now Taft looks like he's anti-environmentalist. This is not carrying on Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. And then finally, the Republicans in the House of Representatives are split. You got to keep this in mind. The Republican Party, you've got progressive Republicans and conservative Republicans. Progressive Republicans, like Teddy Roosevelt, represent a minority within the Republican Party. The majority of the Republican Party generally tends to be conservative, pro-business, anti-regulation, ending corruption and stuff. Taft is going to back, in the battle for Speaker of the House, he's going to back the conservative Republican candidate, Joe Cannon, over Teddy Roosevelt's pick for Speaker of the House, the progressive Republican. Now, as a historian, and I mean, God knows I don't have the time to go into too much depth here, but as a historian, I've looked at this and I've come to the conclusion that what Taft was trying to do was he was trying to be the bridge. He was trying to be a bridge in a party that was divided. And he didn't have the personality to be able to do it effectively. And so in the end, he looks like he's a sellout. He looks like a sellout. He is a progressive, but he looks like a sellout. And Teddy Roosevelt challenges Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912 because he believes that Taft has broken faith with the progressive wing of the Republican Party. And when the conservatives back Taft over Roosevelt, a conservative Republican, are they going to want to bring Teddy Roosevelt back? No, they'll stick with Taft. Taft's been good to them. The conservative Republicans back Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt goes off and he forms his own party, the Bull Moose Progressive Party. So now, in 1912, the Republican vote is split. Progressive Republicans go with Teddy Roosevelt. Conservative Republicans stick with Taft. Now, why is it called the Bull Moose Party? Because Teddy Roosevelt was shot in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, while he was giving a speech. And he got up, and he opened up his jacket, and he said to the crowd assembled, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been shot, but I want you to know that I'm going to deliver this speech anyway." And so with blood running down his shirt, Roosevelt delivers this speech for like an hour.
Where did he get shot?
In the chest. He got shot in the chest. But here's the thing. His speech was in his jacket pocket, and the speech was so thick it slowed the bullet down, so the bullet only lodged under the skin. He is. And so when reporters asked him after the speech how he felt, he said, "I feel as fit as a bull moose." And so the bull moose becomes the symbol of this progressive party. And he advocates what he calls the new nationalism. So he's taking the square deal and he's putting it on steroids. The new nationalism in 1912. Not only is the federal government going to be an advocate for the people and regulate big business, but Roosevelt also talks about expanding opportunities for people. He wants to take that Wisconsin idea and spread it to the country. He advocates the direct election of senators. He advocates a progressive income tax. He advocates, wait for it, national health care. You could have had TR care. Now, Taft is running on his record. He's running for re-election, but nobody likes Taft. The Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, is also a progressive. He is the governor of New Jersey. He believes in progressivism. So really the election of 1912 boils down to who's more progressive. What's the difference between Woodrow Wilson's brand of progressivism and Teddy Roosevelt's brand of progressivism? And the short answer is not much. Wilson takes his legislative agenda and puts it under a banner called the New Freedom. So you got Wilson on one side, Roosevelt on the other. There's old Taft sitting in the back. And what does it boil down to? That's the difference. In a nutshell, that's the difference. Roosevelt believed in regulating some trusts. Wilson believed all trusts were bad and needed to be regulated. Otherwise, they're interchangeable. Roosevelt believed in a progressive income tax. So did Wilson. Roosevelt believed in, advocating for workers' rights. So did Wilson. Roosevelt believed in consumer protection. So did Wilson. Yeah. First of all, what should this tell you about progressivism as a national movement? Go. What should this tell you about progressivism as a national movement? It's popular. So, how well do you think Taft is going to do? How many states? Pick the number of states you think Taft is going to win. One, really? Wow, you guys are harsh. He wins 2. And look, I mean, really what happens in 1912 here, well, you analyze it. You tell me what happened in 1912. How does Woodrow Wilson win all these states? What happened in this election?
He won all the South. The South always.
You're always going to win the South as a Democrat, so you win the solid South. So how did he win all these states?
The Republicans are split.
The Republicans are split. As a matter of fact, Woodrow Wilson is a minority president. He only wins 43% of the popular vote. It means the majority of the American people did not vote for Woodrow Wilson. But in the system that we have, the electoral system, he wins just enough in all these states to win the electoral votes. And so it looks like a landslide, but it really isn't. So what does Wilson get accomplished? Let's look at Wilson's accomplishments under the New Freedom banner. 1, he lowers the tariff. It's called the Underwood tariff. Give me the mnemonic to remember it. Under means lower. There you go. The Underwood tariff. He lowers the tariff rate. He expands the Sherman Antitrust Act to create something called the Federal Trade Commission. The Clayton Antitrust Act creates the Federal Trade Commission. It's still around today. This is a watchdog organization. Their job is to monitor, ostensibly, to monitor monopolies and monopolistic practices in the United States. Just my own personal opinion, I would argue they're not doing a particularly good job today. But the Federal Trade Commission's job was to go after and break up and regulate monopolies wherever they found them. The Adamson Act limited work hours for railroad workers, but it's an attempt to limit the workday. Wilson could do it with railroads. Why? Well, okay, it all stems back to why the federal government could regulate railroads in the first place. ICC, crosses state lines, exactly. The federal government is also going to pass a child labor law called the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. Now, under what authority could the federal government claim that they were doing this? Goods going across state lines. Guys, you can use that interstate commerce clause to regulate anything. As a matter of fact, the civil rights legislation of the 1960s is couched in terms of interstate commerce. That's what gives the federal government the authority to do it. Now, this is a temporary success. The Supreme Court overturns the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act in 1918 in a case called Hemmer versus Dagenhart, claiming that the federal government did not have the authority to tell businesses who they could and could not hire. You do not get a child labor law that is effective until 1938. Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Of course, the Fair Labor Standards Act also creates the first minimum wage, too. Workingmen's Compensation Act. You get injured on the job, you get paid. Federal Reserve Act, currency reform. The federal government is going to make sure that there is enough currency evenly distributed throughout the country so that wealth is not concentrated in one area at the expense of the other. Oh yeah, Wilson was also a racist. He segregated. Yeah, oh God, yeah. I made an argument in my senior paper in college that Woodrow Wilson probably was a member of the KKK. Although I had no distinctive proof, I didn't have a membership card that said KKK on it. There was enough ancillary evidence there to pretty much make that justification. Oh yeah. Yeah. He may have been the governor of New Jersey, but he was from Virginia. Rural Virginia. So he was, a good old boy. Roy was a good old boy. Really had trigger stuff. Anyway, so he segregates federal offices, and that's a negative. But look at what he accomplishes. Where do the bulk of his accomplishments seem to lie? Economically. So if you were to evaluate the success of progressive reformers at the national level, the federal government at the national level, where are they the best at reforming? Economics. Political stuff, that's better done at the state level. Wisconsin plan, California, New York, New Jersey. Yeah, you try to break up political machines at the state level. That's done on a state-by-state basis. Helping the poor. What about helping the poor? What about helping immigrants? What about helping those folks? Where's that best done? In the cities, at the local level. Exactly. Here's your Federal Reserve System. The country is divided up into 12 Federal Reserve districts. Each district has a central bank that prints money for the banks in that region. So if you take out a dollar bill and you look at the dollar bill, it has, and this is a really ratty dollar bill, it has a number on it. This one has the number 12 on it. That means the bill was printed in San Francisco. As a matter of fact, if I look at the seal, it says Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. That means this money was originally printed in San Francisco and distributed to a member bank within the 12th Federal Reserve District. It's the way look, this addresses what the populists were complaining about in the 1890s, that there was an unequal distribution of wealth in America. The Federal Reserve System makes sure that money is evenly distributed. What's your number there? Georgia. It was printed in Atlanta. Yep. There you go. Sixth Federal Reserve District. Now, guys, each one of these Federal Reserve districts has a governor, a head of the Federal Reserve Bank. They meet every 3 months in Washington, D.C., on Constitution Avenue between 19th and 20th Streets. That's where the Federal Reserve headquarters is. And they meet there to make a decision. To raise or lower the prime lending rate. That is the price that banks pay the Federal Reserve to get money from them. Right now, the prime lending rate for banks is essentially 0, which means banks are getting free money from the federal government. Now, the bank makes a loan to you, and they charge interest. That's the price you pay to borrow money from the bank. If the federal government wants people to borrow more money, they lower the prime lending rate, because it makes it more amenable to borrow money. If there's more inflation, the Fed raises the prime lending rate so that people will stop borrowing money. It's a way to control the amount of money in circulation, raising and lowering the prime lending rate. Who's left behind? Blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, they're debating how to proceed. Marcus Garvey is advocating in the United Negro Improvement Association for a blacks-only economy, black-owned businesses frequented by blacks. His goal? To have blacks earn enough money to move back to Africa where he would be emperor. That's why you got the uniform. So what do progressives achieve amendment-wise? The income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and women's suffrage. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Southern High School's SGA and AAMC's Blood Donor Center present A Pint for a Pint. If you donate a pint of blood on March 26th, you'll receive a coupon for ice cream.
The Prohibition Amendment and the Women's Suffrage Amendment, though, come at the end of the progressive era. The Prohibition Amendment is mainly ratified because most of the states have prohibited alcohol from being sold, so it's just kind of a fait accompli. The Women's Suffrage Amendment comes after 8 years of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson slow-pedaled on the Women's Suffrage Amendment until after World War I, when women convinced Wilson that they had contributed to the war effort to deserve a vote. And so you get the president backing the Women's Suffrage Amendment for 1920.
Have your senior ad in the yearbook. Deadline is fast approaching. All students, time is running out for this early bird yearbook prize. Order now.
So what kills progressivism?
All UN members attending the conference at UNC must bring in
World War
hotel
I.
money and pick up committee info.
How does it kill progressivism?
Gentlemen at A206. Model UN meeting next Monday, March 10th at Bulldog Block.
For those students interested in the Jumpstart program for next year or current seniors who want to attend AACC in the fall, a representative from AACC will be coming.
Wilson argues that America is entering World War I to make the world safe for democracy, spread democracy, improve people's lives around the globe. That's a very progressive idea, but it requires America to be permanently engaged in world affairs, and Americans are not willing to spend the time or the money in that kind of endeavor. As a matter of fact,
Saturday, March 8th at the community college between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. This event is free. Meet face-to-face with business people from the arts, transportation, architecture, agriculture, natural.
the rejection of the League of Nations is pretty much the resounding no of the American people to Wilson's ideas of progressivism abroad. America is not willing to go that far.
The high school with the highest percentage of students in attendance will receive $500 from the 21st Century Education Foundation to support their signature programs. In addition, the high school.
All right, and so when we come back next time on Monday, we're going to look at World War I. Okay, you'll hand in the work that you're going to do, and then we're going to look at World War I.
Attendance at 10. Permission forms into Ms. Holcomb.